I'll start from where Mr. Morantinos mentioned that the two trends with the humanitarian and security. There is a third trend, which is development, and this is what, of course, the multilateral banks do, and what we do, one of which is the World Bank, is to address these root causes of migration. At the end of the day, it's about climate and poverty, economic opportunity, social inclusion, etc. And while this is the main mandate, in a way, for some time the development and humanitarian lived a bit separately, and then, but recently there have been a lot of efforts to bring these together, which specifically is relevant for the refugee situations where we have protracted conflict and people living in camps. And I think you mentioned also, what is the humanitarian aid to provide with shelter, but you're right, while we can hope that the conflicts resolve and people go back, we cannot afford to miss the generations of children growing up without proper nutrition and education and so forth. So there's been a lot of effort to support kind of longer-term, development of these temporary communities. So what have been the political responses from our perspective in the universe where we operate in development world? And maybe it's not as pessimistic as Mr. Prodi's past experience, or maybe I'm optimistic, but there has been increased effort in this regard. Just to mention few, you all, of course, are aware of the humanitarian summit that was a couple years ago, after which there was the whole grand bargain work done with the donors and how to move the aid towards local recipients and so forth. That work has continued. There has been effort among the multilateral institutions to put their programs to complement each other, how they work with the forced refugees. The G7 has now actually requesting all multilateral banks to again come together and expand the complementarity and partnership, not just on forced displacement, but overall on migration issues, which is something we're working on. There is, of course, a G20 Africa compact, and which puts a lot of focus on helping Africa develop economically, and there have been 5 pilot countries selected, as you probably know. Within Europe, there is a consideration of the Juncker, expanded Juncker plan for Africa. I don't know exactly what it's called, but it will probably find some resolution which will put a lot of money into similar effort as Juncker plan supported within Europe in terms of partnering with private sector, etc., but for African countries. And on our own side, from the World Bank, as a strong sign of political support towards this cause, we have our fund for the poor countries, which is called IDA, and this has been replenished last year to the record like 50% more than the one before that, and reached 75 billion, and all of it is predominantly for Africa in a way. And within that, there is special allocations for the fragility situations, which doubled from the previous time to 14 billion. There is a special allocation for refugees, which wasn't even there, of about 2 billion. So that we have seen strong support by the world leaders on this issue. And what is also very important, that there is a strong recognition that this cannot be done by governments or by official aid and without private sector, because there is a very strong presence of the whole jobs and economic opportunity that drives many of these situations, and that universe of issues cannot be addressed without private sector, which is the one who would supply the sustainable jobs. And the effort of the governments and of, I guess, as part of the political response to bring the businesses together on partnering on these issues has been also remarkable, I would say. As a couple examples, when we, as part of there is a European effort, for example, to buy the products that could be made by refugees in the Syrian refugees, for example, in Turkey and Jordan communities, and while private sector would actually organize such activity. There are there is a strong effort by G20 to work with the business community from the G20 countries, called B20, to partner with private sector on the special circumstances. Even as part of our own work in the package of the IDA that we received, there is a special window actually for private sector to work in fragile, extremely difficult situations. So this is also unprecedented because it's very risky area, but we're working on how to actually will implement it. But just to say, it's probably a big part of the political response is in the ability of the policymakers to bring the private sector to the table on these issues. Going back to, of course, there are some issues that do require direct political involvement, and in Africa, this would be countries like Libya and South Sudan. These are the countries, for example, where you cannot operate, like as institution as the World Bank, and this does require some political situation. Of course, there is a Syrian conflict on the table. The part of the political response, and this I was recently at the G20 business group meeting that Chancellor Merkel chaired, and one of the interesting comments made was while we can all support the development in the African continent, especially, at the end of the day, a lot depends on the governments of these countries and how they also work towards openness of economy and so forth to bring private sector. So in a way, I agree with what you said, that there are multi-layer. This is a multi-layer. The issue requires political response on national, regional, and global, and on many levels. I just want to quickly run through these things, and if there are any comments or questions, I can add later.
Thank you. Thank you for that round of opening comments. We now have some time for discussion, so the floor is open. Please.
I'd just like to pick up on Mauritino's points. I think they were excellent. I like very much the idea of the suggestion for a meeting or a coalition between the Pope and the Secretary General for a strong statement. I think that's an excellent suggestion. I think it's also an excellent suggestion to have a meeting where the billionaires are invited to the Vatican. And maybe during this meeting, your third suggestion, which is to have a ranking of the billionaires in relation to their giving pledges, I think it's great, so maybe they could be done together. I think great suggestions. And so maybe these can be a part of the declaration or the document that comes out of this meeting. I'd like to pick up on Jeff's point about the billionaires. There are 2,000 plus billionaires. And some of those 2,000 billionaires are in the developing world. Some of them are in Africa, some of them are in Latin America, and so on. And in the case of Latin America, there's a very interesting process going on. And this is the fact that we are mostly middle-income countries. So a lot of donor programs are pulling out of Latin America because we have become middle-income countries. But this has not been, this gap that has been created is not being filled by local philanthropy. And so there is a need to push for philanthropy within the developing world. So I think it would be very important to have a focus on this kind of giving. And I would imagine the same applies for Africa, where also we have a growing number of billionaires. And so maybe that should be an area of emphasis. Speaking of Africa, Cardinal Turkson made a very good point that Africa is not poor, Africa is exploited. And so the response to this is that probably Africa should be supported to develop on its own. And my take is that part of the problem is that the ODA funding comes together with technical assistance from OECD countries, which oftentimes do not lead to sustainable development. It's poorly done assistance. There's a very good book by Damisa Moyo is called Dead Aid, that I like very much, and I recommend the reading of that because it explains how aid ends up being bad in many regards because it's not well done. So a point that I'd just like to make is that South-South cooperation within developing countries should be more encouraged because there are lots of lessons learned from neighboring countries within Africa and between Africa and Latin America that could be exchanged, and that could be an important contribution to the challenge of sustainable development. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Chairman. You know that in the Greek tragedy, in the theater, there is always a solution at the end. And this is a deus ex machina that we are all looking, evidently. His Excellency Moratinos, that we really appreciate all his remarks, and I would like also to express our gratitude for all the support during the time he was a minister for CAICI, the Center of Dialogue in Vienna, establishment and continuous work. There are 2 points I would like to mention. You have, of course, mentioned the difficulties of the cooperation between the European Union, but Europe in large, and Africa. And we all know that there is one big problem of leadership. And we are lacking a European leadership today, unfortunately. I'm not saying about the world leadership. The other questions, for example, the Barcelona process, that was a very good start, and we started that with a great enthusiasm. But we have not seen, at the latest years at least, any support. I'm not saying from the side of Spain, but I think that we have to revitalize this process in order to bring closer Africa, Northern Africa, with the European continent. And then the other question is that sometimes, especially as Europeans, and I, Minister, also spoke as a European, we have to look at the establishment of democracy into Africa, and especially Northern Africa, that we need to give these people some time. We do not expect from one day to another to have democracy in the way that democracy works in Europe and in the United States. And this was, I think, to a largest extent, the fault that was mentioned before, what happened in Libya. We had one foolish guy who, at the end, I must say that he was cooperating very well with the world. And finally, what do we have today? A chaos in that state. And a chaos that created thousands of migrants that were even drowned into the Mediterranean or made it to Italy especially, or to Spain. But we have to think twice when we act. Democracy does not work in the same way that we would expect. So thank you very much for your remarks.
Please.
Thank you. Well, during lunch, I had the privilege to speak to His Eminence Bishop Marcelo about a dream I have. And I said, my dream is to see that the Holy Father will invite all these billionaires that Dr. Sack told us about this morning to be here with representatives of all religions all over the world to create a new fund for sort of development in underdeveloped countries. And this will be under the umbrella of the Vatican with the participation of all religious leaders from all over the world. Now, these billionaires, in order not to condemn anybody, maybe they need a sort of moral assistance and support that their donations will not be misused and will not be subjected to any way of misspending, in order not to use any other word. Now, the Vatican can afford this credibility. The Holy Father can afford it. That's why I didn't talk to His Excellency. Now, he was very famous ambassador before to my country in Lebanon, and it's just by accident that we had these two dreams, which I hope that you will accept it and adopt it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Samak. I have Dr. Rambichan Karunanayakan, and then we'll switch to the next session. So, Dr. Rambichan.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to make two small points about the discourse that surrounds this problem, because I think discourse is also very important. And clearly, there's no doubt that we need solutions that go to the fundamental problems of why people become refugees or migrants. But we do still have a problem of xenophobia, we have a problem of insularity, we have problems of racism and ethnocentrism and so on. And I worry sometimes that if we frame the solution in ways that do not also include a proper response to xenophobia and ethnocentrism, then we are also going to miss something very important. So we can say quite appropriately and easily that we need to channel development into addressing fundamental problems that cause refugees and migration. In other words, and we can solve their problem so that it doesn't become our problem. They don't come to our borders, we keep them where they are, and we perpetuate. In other words, development can become also a mask that prevents us from facing and addressing our own xenophobia, our own racism, our own stereotyping of the other. So we always have to be careful that we frame a discourse of development, but one which is also very attentive to these kinds of ways of representing the other, and that the channeling of aid does not come as a way of protecting our own demonization or demeaning of the other. I have heard also already in our discourse here, these people. We have to help these people. I think what we need is a much larger we, and not the discourse of us and them, but a much larger global we, which includes everyone. And secondly, I think this is not a new point, but I think we do have to be cautious in not framing this problem as a problem of northern solution and southern problems. we have the solution here in the north, you are the problem there in the south. We need much more the language of partnerships, of collaboration, because we are also, speaking as someone who has lived in the north, although I come from the south, we are also part of the problem. We are not also part of the solution, but we are part of the problem as well. So I just wanted to highlight that about the way in which we frame our discourse when we speak about these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Cardinal John.
Thank you very much. Since I am the only African here, I take the liberty to talk again and to highlight a point that has been not made very clearly, but which perhaps I'm the only one who can dare to make it clearly. Namely, the problem of Africa, especially in its relation to Europe, is mutually self-inflicted. And we know that there has been a relationship between Africa and Europe. The problem, however, is that this relationship has turned out to be almost always in a deficit for Africa. And the way forward is how do we change this narrative? And here the whole issue of good governance comes up. The impression is created that the Africans are incapable of ruling themselves well. And you cannot blame people for having that idea, since we always manage to have bad rulers who not only mismanaged our affairs, but manage also to have good friends outside who help them to do it. And we know that many of these so-called bad rulers in Africa couldn't survive if they were not in good relationship with certain very decent quarters out there. Quarters that nobody really thinks of as being corrupt, but they are. When I heard the World Bank person mentioning all the wonderful programs they have for Africa, I said to myself, I don't see it anywhere. Where did this money go to? and because of that, and because of that, as we are now talking about how we are going to raise big funds from billionaires, what is happening behind my mind is, after you have raised all this money, how do we make sure it gets to where it should get to? And let me suggest that let us remember that if we have tried in Africa to have good government, and we have often found that we are not getting assistance from people who are so anxious to give us aid, whereas what we need is good government. Take my country, Nigeria. A gentleman was found with $9 million US dollars in a cupboard in his bed, in his room. And he said it was a gift. Up to now, he's insisting it was a gift. And he used to be the head of our petroleum company. And people were telling me, oh, $9 million, that's nothing. The Mobile will be giving that to people every day. So it was considered as it's nothing to worry. It's $9 million is the kind of money they throw around as bribes to people. So if we can manage to have a situation where we can really have democracy, when we can choose the right people, and when we choose them, they are supported, when we won't get thieves being promoted for governance, and when stolen goods don't find safe havens everywhere, maybe we might be able to make progress. We are not giving up. We are not giving up. We are shouting it out. We are doing our best on it. Maybe a joint effort in this regard. I say I'm the only one who can say it. Otherwise, if anybody else says it, they will say he's insulting Africa. But that's the truth. Thank you.
Thank you. We have comments to close this session by Jeff and Bishop Marcello.
Thank you. Let me say a word about the corruption, a word about delivery of assistance, and a word about the proposal for a meeting. Governments almost everywhere are corrupt. Financially, this is rich and poor. The United States had the clever idea of legalizing the corruption. So we say that anonymous corporate money to politicians is free speech. But it's, of course, corruption, and it's massive. So differentiating, there are only a few governments in the world that I would consider clean. I do believe, from what I know, that Sweden really is not corrupt. If you use the wrong credit card once, you lose office. And there are many cases of that. But there are almost no other countries that are not corrupt in their politics. Money changes hands on large scale, finances campaigns, helps foreign companies or helps national companies to win contracts. The United States sponsors trillions of dollars of tax evasion in tax havens that are U.S. territory. Britain is the host of the biggest tax havens in the world. So this is the first point. Do not ever allow just the finger pointing in one direction. This is endemic to power. Power does corrupt. And it has corrupted. It's a psychological problem. It is a human trait problem. It is a systems problem. Never trust politicians. It doesn't mean they're all corrupt, but don't trust them, because their business is not honesty. Their business is power. And so it's important to just keep an open eye on this. Now, when it comes to development aid, let me make 2 points. It's often said the problem isn't money, but X, Y, and Z, maybe corruption or something else. But for poor countries, let me insist, the problem is money plus. The money really matters. If you're in my business, which is fancy accounting, as an economist, I do budgets. The money absolutely matters. And if you're trying to run a health system or education system, you need funds for that. Of course, you want to do things in a smart way. But the resources are really there. And for 17 years, I've made the calculations to show that even if the government is run by saints, there won't be sufficient revenues for the health care, for fighting AIDS, for other matters. You need the incremental financing. It's not sufficient, it's not the only problem, but it's a necessary part of the solution. So when you then say, what do we need to do? There is then the very real question of how can money be used effectively and not squandered? Because that is a mutual responsibility. If money is given, it should be properly used. This is not as hard as it looks. It just requires design. The first design is, I'm going to help you, but I don't trust you. That's a perfectly fine starting point, by the way. You do it with your plumber, with the electrician, with the person who is shoveling snow. You say, if you live in a cold climate, you get the money after the snow is shoveled, not beforehand. I don't give you an envelope with the money in it just now. These are basic points of contracting. And so I want to emphasize, being in this business, it's possible to design highly effective delivery. It's not based on trust. It is based on respect. But respect includes, you do your job, I will help you to do it. That's different. So I designed 17 years ago the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. The design features of that were that the donors would put in their money. There would be a government-led plan from the country itself, not designed from the outside, designed by the government itself. It would be reviewed by an expert committee. We're not taking your word for granted, but we're not designing it. It's your program. Then, upon approval, the money is dispersed and audited. Did the bed nets get delivered? Are the medicines given? 1 out of 10 times something is stolen. Then the project stops. The person has to be replaced, who's in charge of the agency perhaps. Then the program can start again. It has delivered now millions of lives saved. Very practical, very pragmatic, not achievable without that incremental financing. We need to do the same with education now. Kids need to be in school. Who is to design this? Government, of course. And that then becomes a contract. We have a program for schools, for teachers, for children, and we are going to help you to finance that. And we're going to check that the school's really there, that the teacher's really there. And what's interesting is even politicians who are steeped in corruption will allow such a monitored system to work because they want education in their countries too. So I'm not saying this solves fundamental problems, but it does allow the transfer of funds effectively to deliver practical approaches that save the lives and help poor people. And that, I think, should be the spirit of any relationship like this. Except for one thing, now the ethical issue. We are at the, and the meeting that's proposed, we're at the 50th anniversary, I'm just realizing this moment, of one of the most important encyclicals of modern times, a remarkable document, Populorum Progressio, which was exactly 50 years ago. And in that, Pope Paul VI declared one of the important statements of our time, which is that development is the new name of peace. So the idea was that if you really want peace, you need development. I think in our time we might say sustainable development is the new name of peace. But we're in the 50th anniversary of this wonderful, unique encyclical. And one part of the encyclical I quote in almost every speech, which is when Pope Paul writes the following. Everyone knows that the fathers of the church laid down the duty of the rich toward the poor in no uncertain terms. As St. Ambrose put it, quote, "You are not making a gift of what is yours to the poor man, but you are giving him back what is his. You have been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common use of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich." This is really an appropriate moral framework. This is not aid as charity. This is help as justice. This is just basic justice. This is to make the world a harmonious place where the universal destination of goods is respected. And I think observing the 50th anniversary of this insight is really, both of these insights, is really important. Both the idea that this is real peace building to solve the problems of sustainable development, and that this is basic justice. This is what an economy bound by moral standards means. And it's interesting, and I'll just end here, modern American philanthropy was born with Andrew Carnegie, one of our greatest tycoons and industrial titans in the 19th century. He invented modern American philanthropy, the kind that Bill Gates and others make. And he wrote a book called The Gospel of Wealth, which you can get online and download it. It's a wonderful book, short book. And in it, he says basically the same thing. He says, I happen to be very good at making money, but I don't regard this as my money. This is money for society, for the community. I just happen to be very good at making it. So a rich man who dies rich is a disgrace, he says. This is something where it's now my responsibility to give this in an effective way, and we still have the Carnegie Endowment, we have the Carnegie Libraries, we have Carnegie Mellon University, we have the Carnegie Legacy, because he gave away his money and he invented this concept, and John D. Rockefeller followed, and we got the Rockefeller Foundation, and Bill Gates followed in that legacy, and so forth. And I think, to my mind, this is a very, very powerful model and a powerful idea. So I just want to say that not only are the ideas that are shared here of this dream, I think, right, but maybe we can also link it to the anniversary of this wisdom, this great encyclical, and make it very vivid and vibrant for that reason.
Mr. Martinez has a penultimate word, and then Bishop.
Yes, very briefly, because I forgot to mention some. The first, I was very impressed by the intervention of a friend from Argentina, Gustavo Belif, because we are in the 21st century, we are in the digital era, and maybe for innovative financial mechanisms, you should give some insight for the new technology, how we can really promote and have some success on that. The second, going on what Jeffrey has said about official development aid, I think it was Foreign Minister of Canada, Mr. Person, more than 40 years ago, have the vision and the courage to promote the 0.7% of the developed countries to the official development aid. I think it's high time transferring what was a voluntary engagement to a compulsory engagement of the developed country, OCDE. And maybe to propose that any country, any Western country want to be part of the Security Council has to fulfill his commitment of 1%. And that going what Mr. the Cardinal Madariaga said, we have to promote this, let's say, promotion support of this 1%, 0.7% of the official development aid. If the countries are now called for 2% of the military budget, they say, okay, let's go to be constructive. We can tell them, okay, go to 2%, but go for at least 1%. And that should be our campaign. We have to be in this 1% effort for developing countries for official development aid. To the metropolitan reference, I think we need leadership. You know, Germans have leadership in order to engage with the Eastern Bloc, Eastern European, with Southerners. We're Mediterranean. We are Greek Orthodox, Latin, Spaniards, and we don't know how to share our common interests. But we need to have this leadership from the South to really go. And we have to revitalize the Mediterranean initiative. We are working on that from bottoms up, not top down. So there are some ideas, no, in order that we recognize. And final word to our Indian friend. I really appreciate his comment. I think around this auditorium there is nobody that speak of this old, overpass ethnocentrism. That is over. And that's the reason when I said the coalition between the Pope and the Secretary General, because the Secretary General gather everybody. It's the UN. Everybody is the universal framework. So we Europeans, we Western, have to make a special effort to put aside our past. But please, you, the newcomers, don't be always in the past. Try also to understand us. Because you are always still, I understand, I don't judge. But you feel always, I think in my words and my presentation, I didn't exclude anybody. It was a global, comprehensive, universal framework. But your reaction is because you are still feeling that I have certain flavor of an excentrism. Not in my case. I hope it will not be on your case neither. Thank you.
Cardinal.
In continuation what Mr. Moratinos just said, when a government is designing the budget, the national budget, it's very interesting that in times of crisis, the money for the poor is the one that firstly disappears. Always. When the economic situation asks for austerity, which is a bad word now in Europe, for us, when the Monetary Fund was applying to Latin America, they call structural reforms of economy. In Europe was austerity. Austerity is a Christian virtue and it's very good, but they don't like now. When you say austerity, it's like talking of a bad word. Okay, but when austerity comes, the money in the budget that is reduced is the money for the poor, is the money for social projects, is the money for health or whatever. But the money for the rich or for the same government is untouchable. This is wrong. The money for the poor should be always kept and reducing other expenses, but it's the contrary. So it's necessary to think about this.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists and all of you for a rich discussion.